Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. The question that I was given by Khalil Muhsin was within the Western secular tradition, was there any notable opposition to the trends you outlined in the descriptions of Western views towards technological advancement as an expression of godlike power, right? I have to begin by saying that I have not prepared, right? And again, this is not my topic. It's only one of the topics that I like to, touch upon, right? To think about. And so the question again is, were there any oppositions to this idea that technological advancement, right? That technological advancement betrayed a godlikeness, right, to the human race and to the Western man in particular, right? And here, I guess I would have to say that all traditions, when viewed from the inside, appear to be tremendously fragmented, right, or broken down into a multitude of camps who are brought together into categories solely for the purpose of being able to analyze them, right? And this is again from the inside, right? To just give an example, right? If we're going to think about early Mu'tazilis, right? And we can find that division of the Mu'tazilis into the Basran Mu'tazilis and the Baghdadi Mu'tazilis, right? The Mu'tazila. This has very little to do with when we go in and actually try to think of thinker by thinker and see how it is that they differ. Right. If it were to be that, we could break them down into far greater amounts of groups, right, and tendencies and ideas, right. And so what I had said early in the talk on the concept of Trump, right, the modern age of Trump or the postmodern age of Trump, is that there's a certain thread, right. There exists a certain thread by which we can sort of unify Western thought, right, fragmented as it is, right, and that this thread has a lot to do with this concept of the Promethean human, right, or the Titanic human, right? Promethean human, Prometheus here coming out of a very particular mythology, right, a very particular myth, right, where Prometheus ventures himself into heaven by his own will, steals the fire, comes down with the fire, right, and gifts the fire to humankind, right? And so here he does it by way of rebellion, right? In modernity, this myth becomes completely reevaluated, right? And as apart from its origin, right, Prometheus being given over to the gods by humankind, right? And blamed for being able to go against or having the audacity to go against heaven, right? In modernity, he becomes hailed, right? He becomes again reinterpreted by a multitude of scholars, right? Thinking of Prometheus as now being emblematic of the human who has the daringness to speak for themselves, right? The daringness to be themselves, to exist, right? To be independent, right? And here is that concept which is very, very central to Western modernity, right? This concept of independence, right? Now, the concept of independence doesn't seem that problematic to us, right? Or of moral autonomy, right? Or of absolute individuality doesn't seem that problematic to us because we are born, right, and raised in an environment where this is a central concept, right? And we hear it again, I've mentioned before, every time that we make an argument based on moral autonomy, right, in favor of the deen, right, in favor of some act that we perform in the deen, right? In other words, why do I do this? Right? It is because it is my desire to do so, right? And usually the case at hand which usually comes up is the idea of hijab, right? So hijab is oppressive, right? Why do I wear it? I wear it because it is my decision to wear it, right? And so this has become almost something which is second nature to us, to think of this concept of individuality as unproblematic, right? If we go back and look at our early theologians, we have to see that the way that they understood the concept of individuality, right, or the individual existing outside of the totality, right, of creation, right, and directly under the guise, right, under the tutelage, under the creation, under the development, under the, you know, the rahmah of God, right. We can see, for example, the debate between the Mu'tazilis, right, and the Asharis and Maturidis, right, where what the Mu'tazilis had said, again seeming very much unproblematic to us, to some of us in modernity, is simply that human has efficiency, right, that human has causal capacity, right, that if I will to rip this, right, I cannot blame that on God, right, or if that I will to shoot someone, I cannot blame that on God, or if I will to be abusive to my wife, I cannot blame that on God, right, and in order for them, according to them, to not blame that on God, right, I have to be able to have that power, right, that power to create the act, right, in a sense, absolutely, to be able to create the act, right. Now, the reason why this was found tremendously problematic, right, again, is the idea of how then do we understand the question of omnipotence, right? How then do we understand the question of a God who nothing escapes, right? Whom no one can will anything against, right? Of course, the question is going to be, well, can I then, if I have this realm of freedom, will something against God, right? So on and so forth, right? The question, however, for modernity was not this, right? It wasn't only the question of causality and efficiency, right? The question here has much more to do with the independence to be able to not only distinguish what is right from wrong, right? But in someone, for example, like Hobbes, right? The question is that the humankind has the capacity to determine what is right and wrong, right? In other words, to say that something is right, and later, if they wish to revise it by way of power, right, to then determine that it is wrong and something else is right, right? We will see, for example, in someone like Descartes, right, that, and many people have mentioned aptly, that his whole I think therefore I am, right, cogito ergo sum, right, is tremendously problematic and rather bid'ati in the world of philosophy, if you will, right, whereby the individual acquiesces that awareness exists, right, because he exists, right? In other words, right, how do I know that this is real? How do I know that existence is real, right? It is because of my awareness of it, right? Outside of my awareness of it, I would not be able to determine such a thing, right? In other words, the ego is itself the locus of reality, right? It's the verifier of reality, right? So now the question is, were there people who saw this conception of independence, right? Of absolute independence, right? Of not only independence of will and independence of power, but even independence of morality, which is slowly going to develop. I'm not saying that initially when we have someone like Hobbes and someone like Descartes, that automatically they say that everything is a go, that everything is possible. They do not, right? They only intimate at it, right? They only give the possibility of it, right? And later this is going to slowly develop with someone like Kant, who ultimately says, right, that the private reason is in itself the measure of all things, right? And then later, later with someone like Feuerbach, right, or even someone in our own 20th century, I know that now we're in the 21st, but I am old, right? In our own 20th century, like Julian Huxley, who says something akin to, at this very moment, God is waking up, right? God is becoming incorporated, right? God is becoming alive, right? In the minds of some very few people, right? So in other words, he's talking about himself, right? He says, you see me and my work, this is God becoming aware of himself, right? So on and so forth. And so again, this is going to develop slowly. So the question was there any opposition to it, right? Is there anything from within that is going to look at this and say this is a rather strange thing, right? For one, what I can say is that much of its opposition becomes obliterated, right? It becomes lost, right? The manner, for example, in which we don't really know, Aguizé, right, as opposed to Darwin, right? When Auguste was the foremost anatomist of his time, but he simply looked at Darwin's work and said it's problematic, right? The theory, right? The theory does not match the evidence, right? So on and so forth. So in one way, we can say that for the most part, it's covered, right? It's not really something that people that don't deal with it only tangentially, such as myself, know about it. You'd have to really be immersed in that time to be able to see what are its oppositions, right? However, when we look at this group of people that I am talking about, the idea that they are one single cohesive group is rather problematic, right? As opposed to particular individuals thinking this way. And the idea that these are the only contending group is also terribly problematic. In fact, when we go back, we will notice a multitude of contending groups, right? Some of them which found this definitely problematic, right? From amongst them, we have the Cambridge Platonists, right? Which are certainly going to look at this and think that it needs to be rethought of, right? That it is rather dangerous, right? Other people that we have are, for example, like Paracelsians, right? Alchemists and corpuscularists, so on and so forth. In other words, a multitude of schools, some which are certainly going to look at this idea of independence, right? And become rather enamored with this idea of independence and practicality, right? And the ability to do, right? The human is homo faber, right? As the animal that does, right? The animal that manipulates, right? So on and so forth. And others are going to certainly not fall enamored to it, right? From amongst the people that are going to find heavy problems with things of this nature is going to be someone like, for example, Blaise Pascal, right? Who aptly looks at someone like Descartes and says, okay, Descartes, you might be a Catholic, right? And you might be a devout Catholic, right? However, the attention that you give to God, who you claim is centerpiece to your philosophy, is rather nil, and it's instrumental, right? In other words, you use God only to determine that why it is that your mind thinks in a certain way, right? What it is that the mathematical forms that exist inside of you, right? In other words, as there is God and He creates these mathematical forms, this is how they enter into my mind, this is how I have them, this is how the mind is able to understand reality in a few sentences, and then forgets absolutely about God, right? And then continues with one, I know that two things exist, Descartes, right? And plenty of people have said, well, here we're talking about an embodied Descartes, right? Here we're talking about a European male, elite male, right? At the cusp of colonization, right? And so you have someone like Ramon Grossfogel who is saying that Descartes, his I think therefore I am, in his contemporary political situation, right, says, I am, therefore I rule, I am, therefore I kill, I think, therefore I conquer, I think, therefore, so on and so forth, right? Certainly takes it to mean something like this, right? Then we can have other loose individuals who are going to speak against something like this, like, for example, Berkeley, right? Berkeley and Leibniz, right? Leibniz and Berkeley are going to be some of the last thinkers to imagine a metaphysics whereby God is the central aspect of this metaphysics, right? In other words, an integrated world where there isn't only matter, there is also God, but God is intimately connected to the world. God is intimately connected to nature, such that every aspect and every movement that we see, right, its locus, not its locus, its source is God, right? So here we're going to see other people that find certain problems with this, right? From amongst other people that find problems with it are going to be the Romantics, right? The Romantics, and here again, this is one of these categorizations to unite a whole bunch of people with varying tendencies, right? But one of the things that they're going to find highly problematic is the idea of a mechanized world, right? And we know again that when you look at Descartes, and for me, mechanization, right, and physical determinism is instrumental in this conception of thinking yourself as godlike, right, as Promethean, right? Because you remember, if you take the idea of Descartes that the world is nothing but body, right, and that ultimately everything that happens, every cause and effect has again something to do with the efficiency of bodies touching each other, right? And you unite that to the idea of Bacon, right, where Bacon says knowledge is power, where Bacon says let's cut everything open, right? Let's slice everything open and figure at what moment it is that one body touches the other to produce a particular type of effect, right? And so once we realize a la Laplace, right? Laplace being that person that says that everything is physically interconnected, right? The world is just a very, very large pool table, right? Right? So the whole idea here is that the more that we understand how it is that these bodies work interconnected, right? The more that things are physically determined, right? Cause and effect is physically determined, the more that we will be able to manipulate it as such and liberate ourselves, right? From the burden of nature, right? From the burden of God, right? From the burden of morality, from the burden of so on and so forth, right? And become godlike, right? And so the romantics are going to be from amongst the people that are going to look at this idea of mechanism, right? This idea of scientism, reductionism, right? That ultimately everything can be reduced to body, right? So that ultimately, you, a la Descartes, you look at that animal, right? And you say that animal is a machine. Right? Now there's no longer empathy, there's no longer love, there's no longer something which unites both of you, right? That thing is just a moving, cogs and wheels, right? That once I determine how it works, right? Obviously by way of torture or experimentation, right? Then I'm going to be able to know, to know its essence, to know its reality, right? And so the romantics are going to be people that are going to say there are aspects of the world which you cannot reduce to body, right? There's certainly aspects that you cannot reduce to body, right? And so that's going to be one of their arguments against these mechanists, and again against this disenchantment of the world, right? Disenchantment of the world, meaning the idea that there are not forces out there, that it is not angels that are moving things, right? That there is no actual forces of propulsion and compulsion, and what exists is nothing but bodies, right? And so life in itself, intelligence in itself, right, and anything above it that we can imagine, right, must ultimately be reducible to chemicals, to bodies in motion hitting each other, and creating causes and effects, so on and so forth, right? From amongst them, you might have someone like Scheller, right? And Scheller is one of the people that begins to look at Western thought and imagines that its central paradigm is practicality, its domination, its power, right? So he looks at Western thought for the last 200-300 years and begins to compare it with Eastern thought. Again, we're talking about colonization. How can this happen outside of colonization, right? Outside of being able to have access to the so-called Eastern thought, colonization. Already you have the mapping of the world, right? There's East and West, there's no Africa, there's no South, right? There's no darkness, let's forget about that, right? So we're speaking about colonization. So they have access to the so-called Eastern world, right? Which is still enchanted, right? It's still mystified, right? There's still the idea of ruh, right? Or nafs, right? The ruh is still an explanation, right? Love is still an explanation. Right? And it can be even a naturalized explanation, right? The way that Ghazali does so, that he makes love be a centerpiece of all aspects of reality, right? From the divine reality to the way in which basic humans interact with each other, to animals interact, right? To probably even, unicellular organisms interacting with each other. He would have probably naturalized that too, right? And so Scheller looks at this other form by way of looking at the so-called East, right? And he says, well, these are opposite one to the other, right? And the totality of will, capacity, and intelligence in the Western paradigm is one that is geared towards domination, right? Domination of nature and domination of the self as nature, right? Of the self as nature. Right? And this is not of the self as spirit, right? This is not of the self as self, right? This is not, again, this domination of the self where we speak about contemplation of the self, right? Or where we speak of transformation or reformation of the self. When we say transformation as nature, we mean the domination of others, right? Domination over populations, dominations over other people, right? Dominations over the consciousness, biologies and capacities of others, right? And Scheller is one of the people that looks at this and says tremendously problematic, right? Apart from this, we might have someone like Goethe, right? Where Goethe, for example, begins to look at at the idea of genius, the idea of prophecy, right? The idea of Islam, right? As a primordial, pristine religion, right? And perhaps you can contrast this with his Dr. Faust, right? We all remember the myth of Faust, right? What is Faust? Other than the intelligence being corralled by by our satanic aspect, right? Where it says, how about you direct your intelligence to the affection of all things possible, right? So how about you transform your intelligence into raw power, right? And that is what Faust is offered, right? The capacity to know all and the capacity to manipulate in its like, right? And so here again we see another attack, right? I'll give two more trends and then I'll leave there, right? We might, for example, also look at the Christian trend, right? And in terms of the Christian trend, I'm only really aware more of contemporaries and near contemporaries than of older scholars trying to debate Western thought, right? And the reason for this, again, would be, as I had said before, that Christianity became passé, right? And so it isn't only until I would gather the 20th century that Christians again come with a very, very strong, powerful argument, right? For example, like Archbishop Newman, right? From amongst these is going to be someone like Jacques Maritain, right? Coming through with Aristotelian Thomistic thought, right? Speaking against what he considers the problems of modernity, right? Modernity having two manifestations, right? It being the statist manifestation in communism, right? And in socialism, right? Whereby the idea is that the state is going to direct this human power by way of social manipulators, right? And we're going to direct all this raw power towards the construction of something greater, right? And then there's going to be that alternative modernity, is that modernity, according to Jacques Maritain, right? That modernity of the bourgeois, right? Where basically we're going to speak of freedom and we're going to speak of, autonomy, but really what we're really interested in is self-pleasure, right? The liberal tradition of being able to privatize pleasures and protect the pleasures as privatized, right? And today is going to be that publicization of the untouchable pleasures, right? So on and so forth. So Jacques Maritain is one of the people that's going to challenge this in many ways, right? Ultimately, for example, by speaking of a hierarchy of knowledges, right? And saying that the scientism, which ultimately reduces all things or abstracts reality merely to body, right, is one whose intent is, again, instrumentality, again, domination, and two, simply an abstraction, right? It is not an accurate reflection of the world, right? The world is mere body, the world is mere quantities, might be very, very good when we're talking about war logistics or when we're talking about mechanics or when we're talking about Newtonian physics, but as a true representation of the world that I see, right, the world which is most immediate and close to me, it is not that. Right? If somebody asks me, who is Khalil Muhsin, it would rather be rather disgusting for me to mention his biological makeup, right? To talk about, this percentage of water and this percentage of potassium, and to forget what it is that these compose, right? And those things which are not in themselves measurable, right? Such as your experiences or your emotions or your love, right? Or your relationships to others, right? Or your infinite worth as a human, right? To take both the Kantian, right, and the Maritainian conception of the human, right? That infinite worth, right? Which certainly cannot be quantified, right? It can't be made into monetary value, right? So Jacques Maritain says that ultimately, right, in terms of degrees of knowledge, right, that depending on at what level of reality you are looking at, right, that different approaches are necessary, and that the mathematical, empirical, logical approach is only one abstraction, and an abstraction which ultimately is terribly impoverished, right? By my example of trying to describe Khalil Muhsin before, right, you could see how impoverished that conception is, right? And only acceptable at moments, right? Only acceptable in very, very particular moments where we would say, yes, that is what reality is, right? So on and so forth, right? Someone else, for example, is going to be C.S. Lewis, right? And C.S. Lewis is certainly someone who is very popular and very well known to us and to our children, right? By way of the Narnia, Chronicles of Narnia, right? But other than the Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis was a very important logician, philosopher, right, and defender of the Christian faith, right? And so you can see, for example, some of his attacks against Hume in a work like Mere Christianity, right, where he attacks Hume's logic, right, and says that Hume, a terribly wonderful logician, but that when he wishes to try to prove, right, the non-existence of miracles, and in turn to disprove disprove religion, right, or to speak about human independence, or to speak about, the human knowledge is emerging solely out of experience. Again, human independence, he says that he is a terribly flawed logician, right? In the manner in which Ghazali, in his Incoherence of the Philosophers, says the same thing about the philosophers, right? That when they speak in terms of nature, right, then their logic is impeccable. But when they want to speak in terms of metaphysics, that their logic is terribly wanting, right? They do not meet their own standards, right? And so C.S. Lewis does that in that work. Other works, if anyone is really interested, and I think that C.S. Lewis is a tremendous scholar, right? You might be interested in looking at works like Men Without Chests, right? Where he attacks both behavioral psychology, right, and the method of behavioral psychology as pedagogy, right? Again, for anyone that doesn't know what behavioral psychology is, and by the way, within the concept of behavioral psychology, again, we could speak of this concept of imagining oneself independent, right? Outside of nature, outside of humanity, and godlike, right? And so behavioral psychology becomes the idea that there are no internal states in the human, right? And interesting enough, one of the reasons why someone like Skinner, B.F. Skinner, says that there are no internal states. He himself says that the reason that I'm taking this scientific position, right, or this position within my science, right, within my approach, is because we cannot look at the internal states. So again, it's pragmatic. They do not exist because I can't manipulate them. As such, I will not accept that they exist, right? And so the idea here is that there are no internal states, there is no self, right? There's no subjectivity, there is no self-contemplation, right? None of these things urge us in our day-to-day, right? The only things which urge us in our day-to-day are external material realities, right? And so that ultimately, for a controller, for a scientific controller or manipulator, were they to understand what precisely are the psychological causes and effects between the way that I act, between my behavior and my external environment and reality, ultimately that scientist would be able to manipulate what I do. Absolutely. Absolutely. Right? And the way that he does so is by being able to show that he can, by way of positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, be able to manipulate acts, and very complicated acts, right? Little dances, right? In certain types of animals, right? So, for example, in mice, right, being able to let them move through a maze fairly easily, or be forced to move through a maze, right? Or animals like pigeons being able to make very complicated dances, or being able to make certain selections that you are literally implanting into them. Right, literally implanting into them, right? And so, just to tell you how this ties into the idea of godlikeness, in his novel Walden 2, right, Walden 1 being Owen's project, early socialist project, but in his novel Walden 2, B.F. Skinner, one of the great theorists of behaviorism, right, there he writes a really poorly, boring written novel, right, a very boring novel about his utopia. Right? This little society, this little community that he himself makes somewhere, right? And at the very, very end of this poorly written work, he has himself climb a mountain, look at his little community, and say, and then I looked at my community, at what I had done, and I realized that it was good, right? For anyone that's Christian or comes from a Christian background, you would remember that this is what happens in the seventh day. Right? After God has created in 6 days, then God looks at his creation and says, it is good. Right? And so here, what is B.F. Skinner trying to intimate again, at the very least, flirting with, coquettishly with the idea of, I am nonetheless godlike, right? And so someone like C.S. Lewis is someone who fights avidly against this and finds this tremendously dangerous, right? And he looks at that within that work of Men Without Chests, right? Where he says that contemporarily, right, or rather in pre-modernity, right, the idea is that what is the goal of education, right? The goal of education is to form humans, right? Is to teach you how to be a human, right? And so the idea there is that there is a model for being a human, right? And that your job now is to look at that human and emulate that human, so on and so forth, right? C.S. Lewis also writes a tremendous trilogy, right? A space trilogy, right? Where in the last one, called That Hideous Strength, he most avidly attacks all sorts of naturalisms, Darwinisms, physicalisms, behavioral psychology, all forms of scientism, right? Ultimately, that which reduces reality simply to matter, right? Again, for the purpose of manipulation, for the purpose of being able then to do as one wishes, right? So on and so forth. The last strand, and I'll finish with that, I think that we're far more intimate with it because it emerges out of popular culture, right? This would be sci-fi, right? And so sci-fi for a very, very long time, at least now 100, 150 years, right, has looked at this project of absolute manipulation, right, of God-likeness that I had said Michio Kaku, right, says in that work, right, within 100 years we will be, or we will become the very gods that we once worshipped, right? So here sci-fi has looked at this with not only tremendous disdain, but with tremendous fear, right? Fear, again, at what would have been considered in Greek thought the concept of hubris, right? You remember, the concept of hubris, right? That idea that, the one that rises too high to the sun is bound to be destroyed by the sun, right? Their wings are bound to be melted, right? And so we have examples for, particularly after World War II, but even prior to World War II, we have people like Aldous Huxley who wrote Brave New World, right? Wherein there was this concept of futurism, right? Haeckel, who is one of the students of Darwin, says in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, almost all mysteries have been answered, right? Like, we're almost done, right? And even today they're saying that, right? With the whole concept of the God particle, right? Again, someone like Michio Kaku saying, yeah, my theory of everything is much smaller than everyone's theory of everything. And pretty soon it'll be far smaller than that, right? Pretty soon we know it all, right? And so here there was the idea of futurism, which said we're there, right? Utopia is upon us, right? It's really upon us, right? If the idea is simply, to be able to be nurtured, right, or to be able to produce to an excess where we can all reap the benefits of it, then science has brought this to us, and we will soon all be benefiting from it, right? Aldous Huxley looks at this and says there's tremendous problem to this, right? And so he gives us the option of how scientific domination, right, can create some of the most rigid, right, and torturous forms of existence, right? Perhaps in a minute or two, I will say how his work is also tremendously problematic, right? And obviously emerges out of a male elite, a white male elite, right? And couldn't have otherwise, right? We also have people like Orwell in 1984, who himself is saying, all right, well, if we have the capacity, right, what is it that we're going to do with this capacity, right? And what he says is ultimately absolute control, right? And so here is where sci-fi, emerges and says, well, you have all of this control. What if this control turns back on you, right? And so very early on, we have this idea of developing machines, but what happens when machines begin to control you, right? And this can be done in a variety of ways, right? What happens when, I no longer look at my children, all I'm doing is pressing something that I don't really know, has no actual benefit, right? There's nothing that I'm looking at, right? I'm just perusing through it non-stop, right? And so from that idea to a far more oppressive control, right? Whereby I no longer have any semblance of free will. It is ultimately the machine, the system, which has will over me, right? For Orwell, it's the political system, right? And the fact that the political system can certainly utilize all forms of technology towards absolute control, right? So in other words, we have the technology to make sure that everyone shuts up, right? And does not rise, right? And we know that this is certainly used in certain areas more than others, right? We could think, for example, of Egypt, right? We could think, for example, of China, right? As opposed to a far more benevolent tyranny, right? Such as that which we have in the United States, right? Again, what Walden called inverted totalitarianism, right? Other than that, and we could see a couple of more examples. Some of you might have read the novel Clockwork Orange, right? Again, this is going to be an attack against the idea of absolute control of the human, right? In Clockwork Orange, for anyone that has read the novel, right? Again, we go back to the idea of behaviorism, and that ultimately we are controllable by some scientific entity or some state, right? Some state-determined policy, or some scientific group, right? So on and so forth, right? That has understood how it is that behaviors work, right? How it is that biology works, and is able to manipulate it to the point where I have no free will, right? So in the work, a criminal's free will is completely taken away, right? What happens in the end is that we get that last inkling that even though we think that his will has been completely taken away, his will to violence still lies dormant somewhere there, right? We can see this also, for example, in Dostoevsky's work, Dostoevsky's work, The Underground Man, right? Where again the Underground Man says we're humans to create a glass building, right, with 140,000 algorithms of how the human works, right? In order to be able to control the human, right? Another human would pick up a rock and simply throw it at it, simply to destroy it, right? So in other words, I don't care about the progress, I don't care about the advancement, let this, be destroyed. Why? Out of the will to destroy, right? So these two novels here, their rebellion against modernity is, if we do not have higher forms of being, right, then at the very least the will to destroy, right, the will to subterfuge, right, everything collapses, right, the will to chaos, right, so on and so forth, right. My last words on this would be, right, and by the way, there are many others, right? There's MacIntyre, there's Alvin Plantinga, right? All people who we should certainly be able to study and learn from, right? There are even others who, while born into Muslim families, I do not know if they emerge out of Muslim thought, right? Like, for example, Tal al-Assad, right? So on and so forth, right? But what I would say is that when you look at these various responses are positioned, right? They're very much positioned, right? And so that certainly C.S. Lewis, while instrumental for us, ultimately is a Christian nonetheless. Right? Is a Christian nonetheless, right? And so the very fact, or the very idea that we both worship a single God, if that in fact is true, right? Meaning the concept of the Trinity, right? But if in fact we worship a single God, right? And if in fact we believe in the concept of obedience, right? Or we believe in the idea that there is something called al-ghaib, right? And that naturalism is insufficient, improbable, irrationalistic, problematic, right? It leads to certain tendencies which are certainly detrimental to the world, right? So on and so forth. Nonetheless, the view that he offers is certainly a Christian view, right? A Christian view, right? Again, someone like Aldous Huxley, for example, anyone that looks at his Brave New World, right? His Brave New World looks like someone whose attack against this, right, emerges out of being elite bourgeois, right? So if you ever read Brave New World, and if you remember Brave New World, what is some of the great problem, or who are the protagonists in Brave New World? It's the elites that are the protagonists, right? We never hear about the deltas and the epsilons. We only hear about the alphas, right? We only hear about the alphas, right? And when we look at what alpha life looks like, some people might be willing to say that it's not problematic at all, right? Alpha life is about incessant sensuality, right? Sexuality and sensuality, right? That is, in fact, the problem for Aldous Huxley, right? That incessant sensuality leads to vacuity, right? But where are the epsilons? Because this is certainly not the life of the epsilons, right? So again, you're looking at someone emerging out of a very, very particular conception, right, of an embodied position, who is now looking at the West and looking at some of these problems, right? And as such, his contention is certainly going to be embodied, right? It's certainly going to be embodied, right? And so, for example, even within our tradition, I'm here taking the work of Sherman Jackson, right, of Dr. Jackson, Islam and the problem of black suffering, right? Here is where he looks at a contemporary problem, right? He looks again at the problem of black liberation, right? The very, very necessary and central problem of black liberation, right? And at the question that emerges, right, after looking at something like forced captivity, right? Institutionalized rape, right? Institutionalized torture, right? Prisoner leasing, right? Mass incarceration, right? And he says it is very, very, very pressing for us to answer the question, because it is emerging as a question, or has emerged as a question since the 70s, right? Of, is religion complacent, right? If religion is telling us that the world as it is has been created by God, right? So is God just, and is God all powerful, right? Can we certainly say that God is omnibenevolent and omnipotent, right? And be content with ourselves, right? To say that we can emerge from this, right, as people who are willing to accept black liberation struggle, right? Both nationally and internationally, right? His answer is two, right? Twofold for me, just right here to think about it, right? Is one, Christians or black theology, someone for example like Cone, have already attempted an answer, but this is not our answer, right? They have already attempted an answer, but this is not our answer, right? There's a very, very particular history that goes into black theology, black Christian theology, right? As emerging out of Christian theology, right? And as emerging out of the master's religion, so on and so forth, right? So the question is, what tools do we have, right, to re-look at this question, right? And even within his work, it seems to be that there is not a unanimous Islamic answer to this, right? There is simply a fountain and a wealth of knowledge and of tools which we can use from various schools. And so what he does in that work is he says, how would the Mu'tazilis answer this, right? Then how would the Ash'aris answer this? Then how would the Maturidis answer this? Then how would the Hanbali theologians answer this, right? The traditionalists, right? What he calls traditionalists, right? Or the Atharis or the Hanbali Aqidah, right? No disrespect to the Ash'aris right now, right? Who say that there is only, two schools of Aqidah, so on and so forth, right? And so here, my thought is that yes, there is this treasure trove to be looked into, right? To be looked into, right? In other words, Christian thinkers and alternative strands of Western thought, for example, ecofeminists, right? Or for example, feminists that speak against moral autonomy and talk more about interdependence, right? They're there, and they are good tools, right? Again, they're people that have been doing a lot of work and that we need to look at. Right? And it is a tremendous problem that we have not been looking at them. However, we need more Jacksons, Abdul Hakim Murads, Said Hussein Nasrs, right? Talal Asads, right? People who are going to be coming and saying, okay, it's our turn now, right? It's our turn now. No longer do we need only to turn to McIntyre or Alvin Plantinga to tell us whether religion is in fact coherent with contemporary quantum physics, right? Or whether we must all, move to the hegemony of Darwinism, right? So on and so forth, right? And so they're there, but it's about time now, right? For us to reintegrate, the multitude of sciences, right? The aqli sciences, right? Again into our discourse, right? And then pardon for the rambling, right? Because certainly there was a lot of rambling. I did not prepare, right? Pardon for the stream of consciousness. Pardon for it all. But inshallah, with a lot of editing, something can be done.